This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special featured guest, Steve Dayok, who is going to be talking about 9/11 and research he's been doing about the very peculiar aspects of the plane strikes on buildings in New York City, which most serious students have concluded is somehow completely faked or phony, the question becoming how it was done. Steve, I must say it's a great pleasure to have this meeting with you because we've exchanged a lot of emails, but you can get a very different impression of a person through email than you do through the actual encounter physically, even if it's over the internet. And I'm just really pleased to have this opportunity.
Likewise, thanks for having me. Yeah, we have, you can't emote very well over email, and you don't see any subtleties. But in any case, yeah, thank you very much. And there is a lot to discuss. I have been trying to get this, I think we all think we're right in our conclusions. And I think I am. But if I am wrong, I want to know where, because there's got to be a better explanation. And
well, let me put it this way before we proceed. I have done quite a lot on all four of the plane crashes. But one issue that I have not felt myself to be satisfied with was the creation of the gashes. And I know that's your focus. So I'm particularly glad to have this opportunity.
Oh, well, thank you. Good. So this screen I have here is just a little clip from a PDF out there about crime scene investigations. Now, my wife's a big fan of CSI and those kind of shows. And so I'm not, but she is. And so whenever I walk in the room and she's watching one of them, I see, basically what I am trying to do.
Steve, my wife too. She loves all those. And, Criminal Minds and
I know.
NCIS and all that. I can't tell you how many I've seen myself as a consequence. Actually,
yeah,
I like a lot of them, but I understand what you're saying, okay?
Yeah, they are painfully, to me, they're propagandistic. And
well, but many of them actually are exercises in forensic investigation. I don't know if you've ever watched Bones, for example.
Yes, that's one of her favorites.
Very, very amusing, informative, entertaining. I really like the show. And the three women characters are simply sensational, each in their own way.
Yeah, and they all kind of take the same tack. There can be a minor little clue that changes everything.
Yes, right? That's right.
And so
it's like in Total Recall when the shrink is trying to convince Arnold that he's actually in an illusion, but there's a bead of perspiration that comes down his face that would not have happened had he not been real, and Arnold blows him away.
There you go. Yeah. So there are these little things like that I know I've missed quite a few clues over the years, and when we spoke many years ago, I'm still basically in the same boat trying to answer how they did it. And so what I've had to do is to basically go to the very beginning and a crime scene reconstruction to try to figure out how it was done. And by looking at the evidence of the crime scene, you can formulate a good hypothesis as to what caused it.
Steve, as you may or may not be aware, scientific reasoning is one of my areas of expertise. Yeah. And what we're really talking about is known as inference to the best explanation. Which hypothesis, if it were true, would confer the highest probability on the available relevant evidence? In other words, with say, Sandy Hook, you had no surge of EMTs and no string of ambulances, no medevac helicopter. There were donation website put up the day before. Adam Lanza, the alleged shooter, was recorded as having died on the 13th, making his feet and shooting 20 children and 6 adults the following day, all the more remarkable. What's the probability, if this was a real shooting, that those should be the case versus that it was a staged event? And you realize if it was a staged event, the probability of those is very high. And if it was a real event, very low.
Yes.
And then when the evidence is settled down, we have enough evidence to be confident that you are not leaving anything out and that you're not being misled by fake or fabricated evidence. You're entitled to accept the conclusion in the tentative, infallible fashion of science. meaning you can't guarantee your conclusion is true, even though it's the best supported.
Yes.
And you are entitled to accept it as true, but also knowing that if you get new evidence, new hypotheses, new alternative, you may have to revise your state of belief and reject hypotheses you previously accepted, accept hypotheses you previously rejected, and leave others in suspense.
Yes, I think that we probably both traveled that path with 9/11.
Yes, of course.
Right. So we can agree there wasn't a plane. I think we both agree on that.
Yeah. That my conclusion elaborated elsewhere, such as in the Real Deal episode 100, where I did a 2-hour interview with Major General Albert Stubblebine, U.S. Army retired, formerly in charge of all U.S. military and photographic intelligence, which you can find online. 2 hours going through all the crash sites lead to the conclusion 2 of the planes weren't even in the air that day, and that, in fact, what happened in New York was a sophisticated form of video fakery. There are alternative hypotheses where I am convinced that, in fact, it was done using sophisticated holograms. But the point that is important for you and me to agree, rather than how it was done, is that these were not the effects of a real plane hitting these buildings.
There's no way. You can look at the evidence speaks very loudly against that.
Yes, but, including that there's no debris on the ground beneath these facades. Right. There should have been body, seats, luggage, tail, wings. As I've often put it,
pouring out of these things. You know,
that's
you should have seen them all in the debris field as well.
That's right.
Don't see any of that stuff.
That's right. Go for it, Steve.
Yeah, so we agree on that, and I think, like you, I used to believe that it was explosives that had done the deed. If it wasn't a plane, it had to be something that cut the hole.
Right.
So it was while trying to research what explosives did it that I realized that it may not have been. So simply just, I don't need to, this is for any novices who might not be familiar with the whole idea of what happened on 9/11. So the idea behind looking at the damage evidence, I'm trying to evaluate what hit it. I see physical damage, which to me indicates a physical impact.
Yeah.
But I couldn't wrap my brain around that, thinking this had to have been done with explosives. So how would they do it?
Well, let me just specify the significance of Newton's law here. What it means is the impact, if the plane is traveling, say, 500 miles an hour and the building is stationary, this 500,000-ton building, the effects would be the same as if the plane were stationary and the building hit it going 500 miles an hour.
It should be
equal enough. It can also be viewed from the point of view of the relativity of motion. You could take either of them as immobile and the rest of the world moving. Yes. And so forth. So this is a very general phenomenon.
It is. You hit a wall with your hand. The hand hits your wall with the same force.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
You're hitting the wall. So
these are equivalent descriptions.
Yeah, and so anybody with a little common sense can just look at these pictures and say, this car was struck from the front. This car was struck from the side. Any kid that's ever run a stick against a picket fence can attest that there is lateral damage here. Something struck from the side. That's what I see. If I'm wrong, okay, there's got to be a better explanation.
Well, let's just put it this way. It looks very much on first consideration as though what we have here is damage that might very well have resulted from the impact of an object from the side, an angular impact.
Yes, that's what I see.
And if you take that to be fairly apparent on first consideration, then you're going to need an argument to overcome the presumption that that's what happened.
Yes. And I've had a lot of arguments to overcome that. Using the steel, we know the measurements are pretty much well known. They're 14 inches wide generally. And so using that as a gauge, we can determine that whatever it was that whacked this aluminum cladding down here, I should probably adjust my camera. That's probably too much, but in any case, I won't spend too much time on that.
Everything's good, Steve. Keep going.
Okay. Whatever whacked this piece of aluminum cladding here was not 14 inches and was not very dense because it didn't sever the cladding like it did over here.
Right.
And this little protrusion here at the bottom is where that cladding, the column, that's 12 feet there, where that would have overlapped the column below it. So this is just to give an idea of what we're looking at here to people who really don't know how the towers were constructed.
Well, you're talking about increasing severity of damage from left to right. And
it gets progressively worse. It does, yes.
Lower to higher, yeah. And then you have this roughly a big hole there on the right-hand side that seems to be maximal damage.
Yes, right here on the ninth column. Oops, sorry. There's my...
And of course, we're talking about the North Tower here.
Yes, this is the North Tower, but when, later on I'll show pictures of, and you've got in your slideshow that you can see the South Tower has almost identical damage to the same place,
very similar.
To the same location.
The difference is in the South, they're intersecting with 7 floors of steel trusses filled with concrete, and the South Tower 8.
Yeah, for the whole width of the gash. But when we're focusing on just the left sides of both towers, it's almost identical. We have 8 progressively worse damaged columns, sharply bent to the right, starting with very light damage to the cladding, moving to the right, getting worse and worse until you end up on the 9th column with an inward blasting hole, nowhere near where we were told the engines should have impacted.
Right,
and we see it on the video. You can just look at the video and see, yeah, this was nowhere near where the engines impacted on video. And we can also look at the Purdue video too and show that, you know, they recreated it as well.
Right. Since the engines had the greatest mass and forward motion, they would have been the objects that would have made the greatest impact on the building had a real plane actually hit. But you don't even get the right spacing or effects that would have occurred from the engines alone.
Yeah, nothing fits. But again, with parallel columns, and if you have an engine that's, 12, 14 feet around, it's not going to damage columns it didn't hit, right? I mean, you're not going to get damage way over here caused by an engine that impacted over here. It's going to crush right through the columns it hits and then hits anything behind it. Right. And then, however, the trusses were damaged by that engine would reflect in the damage to the floor behind it.
Yeah, I frequently speculated that if these had been real planes, that probably virtually the only parts that would have penetrated the building were the engines themselves. That the rest would have crumpled externally, body seats, wings, tail, fallen to the ground for the most part, because these external steel support columns, I mean, ignoring the aluminum cladding, were quite massive in and of themselves. And when you figure you're intersecting with 7 in the north and 8 in the 7 in the north and 8 in the south, I mean, it would have posed massive resistance to a real plane. No real plane could have penetrated the buildings, which is the reason why they had to abandon the use of drones. They knew they couldn't do it with drones because no real planes could have done it.
Yeah, nothing. And again, if they could, like David Griscom says, you know, they had a reinforced super duper plane that was somehow light enough to fly and at 550 miles an hour at sea level. I think we
both share similar opinions about a man who professes to be a highly competent physicist and has demonstrated precisely the opposite.
Yes.
So that if he is competent, he's deliberate. If he is competent, then he's massively corrupt.
Yeah. I think it's somewhat of both, but that's just my opinion. What I was getting at is
what I share, Steve.
Yes, thanks. So, given that there are a lot of people in the truth movement who think that they were reinforced planes.
Your sound was better before it got weaker. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, good. Very good. Good.
Okay. So, given that a lot of people believe that they were reinforced planes, had they been reinforced, then they would have struck in a wedge motion. Right, with a 30-degree sweep of the wings, the left wing would have struck the right-hand corner of the column. So we would see absolute opposite of what we actually see in the impact here. So going over what I see here, I see, like you, it started at the left and it seems to get progressively worse as it moves to the right. You can see that here in the damage. It impacts this steel column and sharply bends it to the right. Gets even worse on the next one, and then the next column is shattered. Something exploded on the face, causing the top of it to pop out. To me, this is evidence that there were removed bolts at this location, because you're not going to snap 4 bolts without, I mean, you would see some damage to the column above it, I would think, as well. So to me, this is evidence of at least removed bolts here. And if you look closer at the footage here, at this picture, in other photographs, you can see that these two columns, beside this one that's really popped out, are also wedged loose a little. So it looks like they were all removed from this location. When you look at the damage evidence, you can see where the seams were pretty clearly. And so when you look at the damage, you can see that these were seams to where there should have been wall panels connected. Now, on this one here, you can see this wall panel that connected to the seam above it was just cut in half and bent to the right as well. So what I see is that if these seams actually had bolts in them, there should be similar damage to the top and bottom. If it hit only the column below it, it's not going to just snap all these bolts without causing some sort of trauma to the columns they were connected to. So to me, this is evidence that they did a job on these buildings and actually prepped the locations for whatever they were doing.
Right, well, they knew they had to. If they're going to fake a plane hitting the building, what's going to be most convincing to the public is that you see some residue, the effects. So they tried to create a skeletal outline that would, correspond roughly, and given the naivety of the public and their virtual total ignorance of physics, not to mention aerodynamics or explosives or any related issues, they felt they could do a con job, pull a fast one. Yep, and they did, and they did, and they did.
And they still are.
That's right, I know.
So what most people don't know is that how they were constructed. So, you can see these are massive columns. These weighed, 4 to 6 tons a piece. And they were put together in sort of like bricks on their sides. And so each one of these panels had, wherever there was a spandrel there, you see there should be a floor on each spandrel.
And frankly, Steve, no aircraft could penetrate even one of those. I mean, you see the damage from hitting a small bird in flight. If you'd hit one of these chunks in space, it would have obliterated the aircraft.
It would have shredded it like a large heirloom tomato on a tomato slicer.
It would have been horrendous. It would have been horrendous.
Yeah, so, and for most people to understand what we're seeing here, I just threw this in here too. Each of these connections had 4 bolts at the point of impact, more bolts below that level, but that's all that had to happen was for them to remove these bolts to prep the area for whatever it was they were planning to complete their ruse, because they were pulling a con job.
And they would have had access from inside the building to the bolts.
Absolutely. The thing is that you can't get access to those bolts and still have a wall there. So obviously the tenants of those floors had to have been aware of this.
Very good. And, of course, the gelatin group, these so-called Israeli art students, had access to both buildings. They were doing performance art outside of the buildings, but they appear to have been the agents who had access to these parts of the building and could have arranged it.
Yeah, that's a possibility, and I have considered that as well. But to support the conclusion that, yes, there is evidence that bolts were removed, you can see it throughout the debris fields. Here we have bolts, empty bolts here, a nice guy with a clean uniform right here, and there's always an American flag in the shots, almost always. Again, clean outfits, remove bolts wherever you look. You should, I will show you some examples of bolts that you can see empty bolt holes here. Up here you can see 1 bolt that was snapped off and 3 that weren't. So 3 empty holes and 1 bolt there. So if, for example, they did prep these buildings by removing bolts, that would be one way to go about making sure that it would collapse the way they wanted to. I know it sounds outrageous, but this is the evidence I'm looking at.
Well, of course.
Here is an example of what I consider to be, pretty strong evidence that they removed at least 2 of these bolts, and when the column panel fell away from the tower, it bit these bolts and snapped them off. So if indeed they had prepped this panel by taking out 2 bolts, this is exactly the sort of damage I would expect to see on that connection after it fell apart. And this is just to show people that what we should expect to see in the debris field would have been thousands of trusses. All right?
Yeah, sure.
These things all over the place, and you can see them in other collapses of other buildings. You can see evidence of trusses everywhere, and but you don't see them in the World Trade Center. What you do see
filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete, because the trusses had V's that were 4 inches deep somewhere. Some places it was 8 inches deep, other places 4.
Yes, depending upon the floor. On the mechanical floors, they had to be a lot beefier to support the weight of the large elevator motors and other heavy equipment. In this case, though, I'm looking at just the construction. This is look at all the trusses up there. And these straps, you can see here, there's some lines here where next to this guy. These are the straps that were attached to the wall. They gave it a little more resilience to keep the trusses, snug up against the wall and give it some flexibility. These straps were poured under the concrete. Any floor that had concrete, these straps would be poured into them. And so when you look at the evidence of the debris field, you can see the straps hanging there on the walls. So this is the level where the lobby ceiling would have been.
Yeah.
And you can see evidence of the remains of the lobby ceiling where the ceiling material met the walls. Okay? And you can see the truss straps just hanging there. Now, that shouldn't be the case, because these lobby ceilings were built with I-beams. They weren't trusses over these sections. They were I-beams. And so we can see evidence that the lobby ceiling at least used to be there, because we can see these straps that used to be attached to the trusses or the I-beams that are no longer there. So that makes no sense whatsoever. How could the straps be there and the trusses they were once attached to not? Did they just all snap in the same location? And the other thing is that you don't see any other straps, like you can see the straps hanging on all along the lobby ceiling area, as well as the mechanical room ceiling area. You can see the straps. Above that, you do not. You don't see any evidence of where the ceiling met the walls, like we did here. You should see that stuff. Every one of these floors above the lobby ceiling had to have concrete where it met the walls, if those floors were there. They're not. You don't see it anywhere. You don't see trusses throughout the debris field. And furthermore, this is from the FEMA photo op, which is what I call it. If you go through the FEMA photo op, you'll notice that all of this heavy equipment has been sorting this material for many weeks before the FEMA photo shoot happened. So they were out there with search dogs and all these, search and rescue teams from all over the country after heavy equipment had already been sorting the material. It's a total propaganda photo op is what that was. But you can look here at all of the remaining floors that should have had trusses attached to them with concrete floors above them. You can see evidence where the ceiling of the lobby was, but nothing above that area. Here again, no evidence of floors where they met the walls, but you can see it where it met the lobby ceiling. So if floors had been removed, the evidence is there. There's more evidence of it here in the impact zone, where you can see these two wall panels curled in like a clutching hand. Well, right here at where the spandrel is for both of these columns, there should be a floor scooped up in those knuckles. Right? You should see some material in there. You do not. Again, this is just evidence that I see of removed bolts from this seam here, because this whole wall panel was struck so hard that it curled in like this, didn't even damage the one that was attached to below it. Could not happen unless the bolts were removed, in my opinion. This is the same view from a different angle, and again, you can't see any floor material where it was supposed to be scooped up in that wall panel.
What in the world is that figure doing there?
That is a fake image of a man. That's an official photograph of a jumper who was allegedly jumping out of the North Tower.
But it's photoshopped.
Yeah, it's totally photoshopped. Yeah, it's a fake picture. They had real images real images and fake images to fool people. And then they put the Simon Shacks of the world out there to tell us that it's all fake. And thereby destroys all the evidence.
In relation to the damage, I mean, if he'd actually leaped, he would have been out of the picture. I mean, you know, given what you're seeing here, they're not consistent causally.
Yeah, this guy looks like he's actually in a park somewhere, sitting on a park bench, leaning back and pointing at someone.
Yeah, sunning himself with his his manly chest.
Yes, and it's totally Photoshopped, but even better, this is part of a museum exhibit in the 9/11 Museum that is purported to be this wall column, this panel. They found it in the debris, Jim.
That's supposed to be the very panel there.
That's what they're saying. It is not. You can see easily by looking at it. It's a it's a facsimile.
Have the same features. Yeah.
So, but this just goes to show you the kind of propaganda they're putting out there.
The gall.
Yeah, the sheer balls of it.
Brazen.
Yeah. So just to demonstrate what we should have seen behind each one of those columns, behind each spandrel, we should have seen floors and trusses. We did not. More of that, you know, for people to wrap their brains around. On the side that was impacted on the North Tower, it should have been 60-foot of truss on each one, you know, a lot of them there. I don't know how many they had, but you can see this is what we should have expected to see behind each one of those things. And we should have seen, you know, piles of trusses in the debris field. So either they were disintegrated and the straps were left alone, or they weren't there.
Well, as you're aware, I believe this was done with a sophisticated arrangement of mini or micro nukes that were directed upward and that were used to blow the building apart from the top down and convert most of it into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust, which it would seem to me could account for the missing trusses by and large. But it's very interesting that you make the point.
Yeah, but the straps are a troublesome issue, because if the trusses were vaporized, then these flimsy little straps should have been vaporized as well.
Along with them.
Yeah, but they weren't. They were disconnected where they were connected to the knuckles and then left hanging there on the wall. To me, that's evidence of being dismantled. So some people think it was a real jets. I'm just going over this for the people who are still fixated on jets. But
right.
this is we are to believe that this wingtip was at once so light that it could only lightly pinch this cladding here on the left, but it was somehow a few feet later able to sharply bend and gouge steel columns in a completely different direction than the wing was traveling. Just to show other people what we expect to see here, the cladding was very thin that went over the top of the columns, and just to get an idea as to how thin, that's pretty thin aluminum sheeting. They were 12 feet long with seams at spandrel level. So we should expect to see sort of a wedge attack if it was a real plane. This is not for you. But we didn't. We see just the opposite. We see left, instead of being struck on the right corners of the columns, we see them damaged on the left corner and struck in a completely different direction. This is the North Tower here, South Tower here. We see the same sort of pattern, lightly damaged cladding on the far left, progressively with steel damage. This one's just gouged out completely. And then here it looks like whatever it was deflected and actually popped out. This column, the cladding here, and you can see all of these columns here are twisted and bent to the right, and both of them show an inward blasting hole on column number 9. So I think we both agree it wasn't a plane, but to answer what it was, I've broken it down to what the available options are. I'm not going to go all Judy Wood on you, but these are what I think are the options that are available in the real world that can be verified. Some would argue that there's secret technology that could do this sort of thing. Okay, but I'm unaware of it and it can't be proved. So
I mean, look, if you overlooked an alternative, then of course you'd have to revise your assessment if that were to be proposed. As a former artillery officer in the Marine Corps, I find all this quite fascinating.
Well, you can correct me too, I'm sure, because I definitely don't know as much as you do on these things. However, as I was investigating this damage, I started coming to the conclusion that there had to have been a physical impact, that even if explosives could do what they thought they could do, why would they mimic a lateral impact instead of mimicking what they were showing on television? So I'm trying to break it down to what I consider are the possibilities, and I just basically scratch artillery off and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think artillery is far too powerful and too identifiable to be able to
yeah, I don't see any indications that artillery was used in this instance, but it's interesting to talk about it.
Yeah, so you can see that artillery, solid shard artillery in World War II did a number on these poor bastards in these pillboxes here. But that steel's arguably much thicker than the steel would have been on the World Trade Center. So artillery would have left an easily recognizable hole and can therefore be discounted.
Well, I'm not quite sure. Those look probably more like tank rounds having hit that pillbox if I were to...
Well, they were from actually naval artillery. They just leveled those poor suckers before they even stepped foot and tried to attack them. But yeah,
was this on D-Day?
I'm sorry.
I was just wondering what location, what scene that those came from. But
that was
it's incidental.
Can't recall. This would have been D-Day. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
In any case, laser weapons you can probably take off the list because they're probably more lasers would probably be more useful as a guidance system than actually burning through. There's no damage to indicate that lasers were used, is what I'm trying to get at. Microwaves, I love this. Microwaves are reflected by metal, so they would be completely inappropriate to be used as a weapon to cause the damage. And particle beams don't cause any kind of the physical they can cause kinetic damage, but nothing like what we see in the World Trade Center. So these can pretty much be disregarded as possibilities.
Good.
Explosives, I think there had to have been explosives in conjunction with what I think were missiles, because there is evidence that explosives were used, at least in some of the spandrels that were shattered. These things were just destroyed. But again, I don't see a lot of evidence for the use of explosives at the very far left of the
well, you may find this amusing, and it's an alternative hypothesis to those you have specified, but I have contemplated that it could have been thermite or nanothermite that was used. I think you could, if you throw it in, also eliminate that alternative, but it is one you don't have in your original set.
Yeah, I didn't include it because from what I've heard about thermite and nanothermite, it's not going to cause the sort of lateral bends that we see, and it's not
that's right. It'll cut right through. It's just that it might be an hypothesis worth adding in order to eliminate for those.
Okay, thank you. And I think that it could be considered as something that may have been used in the collapses. I don't see any evidence of that in the impact damage, but I could be wrong.
I think Niels Harrod estimated it would take 29,000 metric tons of nanothermite per tower.
If everything was in there that was advertised. That's the other thing, is, with the evidence of missing bolts and floors, maybe maybe it was like a big magic trick where where the trick was just to advertise that these things were the fully occupied cities within the cities that they told us they were.
Well, they were open since 1970.
I know.
It's very difficult for me to imagine you'd perpetrate this fraud. You're talking about empty towers or hollow towers, or
But if anybody could do it, it was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey.
This would be another hypothesis to add to your set too, I suppose, unless you're arguing that that's the result of your research.
No, that's just peripheral.
Okay.
But again, if you want to go there, yes, if anybody could pull it off, it would be the Port Authority, because they are a quasi-governmental body that does not answer to the public. They can seize property through eminent domain. They only answer to two people on the planet, and that's the governors of New York and New Jersey. They don't. In other words, all of the statistics that we have for the World Trade Center during the time that the Port Authority owned it, we have to take their word for it because we can't verify any of it.
Well, there's going to be a massive documents of leases and all that sort of thing, and
but it's all from them.
No, it could be, but I mean, you're talking about a staggering documentary falsification process over decades and decades.
Well, these are the Rockefellers. I mean, we're talking billionaires. They don't care.
Yeah, but it seems to me a stretch, Steve. That's all I'm saying. You know, why create the buildings to be phony, empty buildings? You know, that doesn't make, to me, a lot of sense.
Because these guys work over decades, and they are planning on invading the world over this thing. But I'm still focusing on what the evidence shows.
I certainly believe that Bibi Netanyahu thought this up in the late 1980s, and with the demise of the Soviet Union, there was an opportunity to promote it by the neocons through Project for a New American Century, and they got their ultimate result because the towers had become white elephants. They had problems with tenancy and were loaded with asbestos, and it would have been prohibitively expensive to build scaffolding to remove it. You couldn't take it down by a classic controlled demolition because it would have released all the asbestos and biohazards into the air. How convenient that we happen to have two terrorist aircraft perform a demolition job that couldn't otherwise be done at a price that Larry Silverstein was willing to pay.
Yeah, well, I think that however you pronounce it, Silverstein or Stein, I think that he probably very well knew that these things were ready for demolition, and that was what his role was to be a lightning rod.
When you got it takes personal and private possession 6 weeks before the event.
Well, sure.
Hires a security team that has been looking after the tower since 1970. Gets a new insurance policy with a terrorist clause so he can claim double indemnity, and winds up collecting like $4.5 billion on a $114 million investment. Those things don't happen. Those things don't happen by accident.
And they don't happen overnight. So that was all well prepped in advance. There's no way that he walked into this.
The designs for the new World Trade Center 1 were actually prepared in advance of 9/11. So.
Yeah, there's plenty of information that I don't have in the slide set that goes back and talks about how much it would have cost they would have been forced to dismantle them. They weren't going to be allowed to demolish them because of the asbestos, but the asbestos was only like 40% of Tower 1. They changed their fire retardant about midway through the construction of Tower 1. Anyway, so we're left with shape charges that can cut through steel like butter, but there's no evidence that they were used to cause the impact damage. This is just footage of shape charges, what the damage is. EFPs are explosive penetrators that they can cause all kinds of damage with a shape charge projectile. There's no evidence that I see of that sort of damage throughout the World Trade Center. So to me, it leaves missiles. And then it starts getting difficult because people just reject missiles right off the top of their heads because they think somebody would have reported it.
There was a report of a missile being fired from the Woolworth building.
Actually, there are quite a few.
Don't go too fast through these slides. I mean,
I want to get to the Woolworth building here. These are the reports from the Woolworth building, and you'll notice that most of them are from the media and the authorities.
Yeah, it's rather stunning if you look at who was calling into the various networks. They were all related to husbands or wives, close friends, even actually hired by, working for the networks. I mean, they had complete control over the information they were allowing to come in to put out.
They did, and yet they still had Don Dollar and Dick Oliver talking about missiles. Because remember, the second impact happened about 18 minutes after the first, and until that time, nobody knew what had happened. but the majority of the reports were that anything other than a large plane had caused it until that point, until we all saw it on television, and then everybody's, oh, a second plane.
Right.
But if we see, you know, the footage.
But we might keep open the possibility that this was a missile attack on these buildings. And at about 10, I would say 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, there was a loud sound that I can only describe as it sounded like a missile, not an airplane.
So we did have reports of missiles, quite a few actually, and not just at the World Trade Center, but at Shanksville as well. So if we believe Newton and anybody with today's 3D animations and videos, it should be pretty easy to understand that these videos are a piece of cake to fake. But what a lot of people have a problem with is realizing that not all of those impact shots took place live. All the videos of the Flight 93 penetrating the wall happened after the live broadcasts.
You mean 11?
I'm sorry.
Flight 11 or 175?
I'm sorry. I got totally.
Yeah,
Flight
sure.
175. Flight 175. The second impact.
Sure.
We only were shown what, 5 or 6 views of the tower with the plane flying behind it, followed by an explosion.
Well, there are about 52 videos that show.
Yeah, but only 5 or so. There were only a handful that were shown live.
Oh,
and
right.
And all of them show a building
from
with
the
the plane.
opposite side where you don't see the plane.
You don't see the face getting hit.
Right.
All of those happen later, and each and every one of them shows anomalies.
That's odd all by itself, isn't it? You'd think the news they would have cameras all over the place. Once you have the first hit, you'd have teams out there everywhere.
Yes. And so what I suspect is that they did have a team of 50 some odd propagandists out there who were deployed to capture the footage so they could, because if you know anything about video editing, it's a whole lot easier to add things to real video than to fabricate an entire scene.
Yeah.
And so you use a tripod.
Well, there are the 3 theories of CGI, which the Webb's very advanced, or of video compositing, Ace Baker, or the hologram, Richard Hall. So you have advocates of those 3 different theories about how it was done. Right. And so we have, I think Ace Baker's probably closest to the right, but he hates the missile prospect too. So we have the Steve, let me make it clear. I only care about the truth.
Good.
Not whether I had it first or always had it right or whatever. I just care about sorting it out. That's why I find this really, really interesting, because it's an area that I have been self-conscious about not having explored sufficiently. So I'm particularly pleased to have this opportunity.
Well, it's not my hypothesis anyway. It's I think it was Holmgren who came up with it at first.
But the guy was a genius. The guy was a complete genius. I'm increasingly suspicious that his death was.
I agree.
No accident.
Yeah. So just to go
ahead
over
of his time.
He was, and I have a video. I've just done a transcript of his. I have a video of his Skype conference call that I got from Rosalie Grable before she passed. RIP. And I just transcribed it because it's terrible audio, and he's got a thick Australian accent. Yeah. And it's
in many ways, the rest of us are still catching up.
I know, it is amazing, and he just winged it.
Guy was a genius.
he had it nailed. Any case, so I'm showing this footage just because we're all familiar with the Herzog-Connie, and just pay attention. You can see here that the smoke here beside the building freezes. Right at the time it penetrates the building, the plane penetrates the building. To me, this is total evidence of fraudulent video, and I've broken it down to frames. Mm-hmm. You can see slight motion. It's hard to see. I had hoped to gotten way further along on this presentation by the time we actually talked,
Steve,
so I could
great. This is
so I could highlight all of the smoke.
Steve,
but,
this is great.
Well, thank you. So when you goes frame by frame, you can actually see the smoke freeze to the left of the building here.
I'm looking at it.
It stops moving. See that?
Yeah, yeah. Basically for the purpose of animation or video compositing.
Yeah, so, and again, when you look at the towers, it's a square tower, and you can see there's a shadow here.
It's always been peculiar, had the total lack of definition of the facade itself. You know, it's just like a blur.
Right, so what I see here is that, and actually if you go back and look at the Hertz Arcani at his actual shot,
yeah.
let me back up a bit, there's a point, because I do a lot of messing around with footage. I try to make things disappear just because I like to make videos of Christmas.
Good.
And I've got some good Darwin Awards shot of myself doing construction and almost killing myself and knocking things off. And so I would put up...
Did you actually receive a Darwin Award?
No, not yet. Give me a minute.
Well.
Give me a minute.
Very good, very good.
So, so I know how easy it is to create, to make things appear and disappear on video. All you need is a tripod. And each and every one of these guys was on a tripod. When you look at the Hertz Arcani, he spends a lot of time, he's got his fluid head, he's moving around like he's not on a tripod. These guys are pros trying to look like amateurs, okay?
Good.
Excuse me, I gotta get some water here.
Good, sure. Yeah,
and you can see him zooming forward, zooming back, and then he locks it in for a split second of like 2 or 3 frames, and that's his predefined, rehearsed location before he's gonna pan up to find the shot of the plane coming in.
Very good. All very good.
Right there, he just locks it in. I think this is the spot. And then boom, pans up, catches the frame. So you can see right there, the guy was on a tripod. Every one of them were. The, what's his name? Luke Cortez, he was on a tripod, very obvious. Even Naudet used a tripod, and you can see where he took it off the tripod just before he hops in Pfeiffer's truck to drive off to the World Trade Center after the first shot. They all used the same means. They had to have the propagandists out there to capture whatever really did cut the holes before they could edit it out and put in a plane of what they were showing. They added enough anomalies to their footage to give the truth movement something to talk about for the next 15 years, and to avoid the conclusion that, yeah, these guys did edit. The Hertz Arcani shot, this one in particular, vexed me no end. How the hell did this guy do that? The only way that I figured it out is that smoke stops moving. So he had he cut out the square front here, right here, is easy to cut out of any footage.
Well, he repeated the same background frame and moved the plane forward.
Yeah, and it's just like it's a TV trope. It's a website.
If you look at the sequence on the left here, Steve, you can see that the smoke pattern isn't changing.
Yeah. And so that's fraudulent footage. There's no other way around it. And if one of them's fraudulent, odds are pretty good they all are.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so what gets me is, well, what are they covering up? Because it's not just the plane that's fake; it's like the whole scene. So this is you know the camera spoof. It's from, you've seen the videos where the crime caper where there's these criminals who are going to go rob a safe, and they take a Polaroid snapshot of the scene of the security camera, the security guard's watching, and they stick the Polaroid in front of the camera. You've seen this on videos over and over again, right? It's called the Polaroid punk. It's a camera spoof. They use it in like Hudson Hawk, any number of movies.
You know, it's actually good we're not doing full screen here, because we can see, you know, the sequence and that the smoke isn't moving by just looking down the side.
Yeah, right here. Yeah. And you can see that it's
very good catch. Very good catch.
Pretty hard to deny.
Has anyone else in the world realized that the smoke isn't moving?
I don't know. I mean, I was fixated with Ace Baker's thing for a long time, where he did the ghost plane, you know, and that's very convincing. But that doesn't even address the fact that, yeah, there's probably both. He had to have because the plane's not real, but the footage was at some point. It just, he froze it right there. So what that tells me, and this is what what gets me is all of the footage of the explosions and the smoke, you know, the fireball,
Yeah.
all of it matches. It's identical depending upon the perspective. Every photo matches, every video matches. So to me, that means that footage is real. There's no way they're going to be able to fake that anyway. Any fraudulent footage of the explosion would have blown the whole thing off the map, because that would have been easy to compare from different perspectives.
Right. Well, they have pre-positioned jet fuel, napalm, whatever they use.
Yes, they had that in the building. Yes, because whatever cut the holes was not the fireball.
Right.
So,
well, this is all sensational stuff, Steve.
Well, thank you. But after the penetration, the smoke starts moving again. We can see that in the footage later. So there's a period just after the plane enters the building completely, but just before the fireball, which is really the only place they could have melded the two scenes together. So that's where they went from pre-recorded plane footage composted onto their live footage with their frozen screen there off to the side. But it was just like one of these Polaroid punks where they took a video camera, put a fake scene over it so that the security guard thinks that the safe is just fine. Meanwhile, they're in there drilling into the safe, and he can't see anything because they're seeing footage on top of other footage. That's what they did to us.
You just have this one more slide?
I've got a whole bunch of stuff, Jim, but I'm not prepared to go.
But I was just going to say, remember when you skipped over a group of slides there?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Can we go back to those? Because those were very interesting to me, but we discounted them. And then you can talk about your theory of how all of this was done. Yeah, work forward from there, right.
Yeah, went from here.
And go on to the missiles and the witnesses about the missiles.
Yeah, so the witnesses are later after this, but most people disregard missiles because they think everybody saw planes. If it was my operation, I would have had lots of stuff in the air for people to see. I would have had flyovers, and you can see that in other footage of the white plane that you've seen, you know, that was reported over Manhattan. There's actually footage of it. If I had my wits about me, I would have had a link to that here, but I have it on my website. And I'll create a video of all this that'll explain it in more detail when I'm better prepared.
Steve, we can do it again, my friend. This is a great introduction. I love it.
Well, thank you. But again, when it comes down to missiles, you know,
you're clicking on the inside of the slide when you want to stay outside it. Yeah.
Okay. Delivering a destruction from afar is as American as baseball, and we've got the missiles, aircraft carriers, and battleships with lots of hands-on experience to prove it.
Right.
But 10 years ago, the big stick was cruise missiles. That was, I can't think of any international diplomacy that wasn't solved first by softening them up with a few tomahawks.
Sure.
So most people disregard missiles because they think people would have reported it. Well, they did report it. And the thing is that the authority, who would they report it to, were the people that were selling us the planes. So of course they're not going to tell us that everybody saw missiles. They're going to try to limit that, and that's what we saw. After the second strike, nobody was talking missiles because you had a camera stuck, a TV stuck in your face. So it was a plane.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah. So the next one is what people would have seen had they seen a missile. Now, mind you, you're in Manhattan. You're minding your own business. You're trying not to get hit by a cab. You're surrounded by hustle and bustle of the city. You're not going to be looking up for a missile 1,000 feet over your head.
You can play this, right?
And if you did look up, you would see this. This is a flyby of a Tomahawk in Iraq, and this guy was ready for it. You can see that the cameraman was ready, and you barely see this thing.
Yeah.
It's just, and it's gone.
Right.
And he was waiting for it. So 1,000 feet below, in the hustle and bustle of the city, you are not going to be seeing any missiles.
Well, you're unlikely to, and if you do, it's just sort of a glance, and you try to figure out what was that, you know.
Yeah. And then when you have a TV shoved in your face, you're going to say, oh, it must have been a plane. It was going so fast. Well, I get a lot of grief because they think, well, how are you going to have multiple missiles hit these things? They don't fly in formation. Well, look at this. They do.
Why multiple? Why multiple missiles?
Because, well, I'm not going to be.
You can't just argue the openings that were created by a single missile from the side of that glancing blow.
No, there's just no way. It's too small. The missiles are too small to be. The missiles are too small.
Really?
Yeah, and these are bunker busting missiles. So to get to what the evidence shows, and it's not just any missile that can do this, Jim. It's got to be something that's a bunker buster, and that's what a JSAM is, a Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile. They have a warhead that's 60 by 12 inches. So if you look at these, the size of the columns, we know to be 14. So if you look at the big bend here that bends to the side, I could picture a 12-inch warhead causing that. They weigh 900 pounds, and at a glancing angle, the wing would impact first, okay? Which can account for the pinched cladding or the lightly damaged cladding. That's where the wing of the missile impacted the columns first and just whacked it like a stick. It's very small and not very massive. They're fiberglass or whatever. As it moved further to the right, the fuselage would impact and shatter against the columns. And then the warhead, the 900-pound warhead, would carry on like a large bullet. And you can see
how many are you proposing hit each building?
I don't know, as many as it takes to account for the damage. But I figure I wouldn't want just one.
You would think if they were hitting that there'd be a certain homogeneity or similarity in the damage from each of the different missiles.
Well, you see that though. You see practically.
It can't be a very large number. It would seem to me.
I would think not. But this is just the wingtip, Jim.
Steve, you're giving me so much to think about. Have you got more slides that we haven't covered?
Yeah.
Because this is okay. Good. Go for it.
And so this is an artist's rendition of the concept. If I could just click on the button here.
Okay, good. Okay, good.
So you can see how coming from the side the missile would hit, it would pinch the cladding with the wing, and then the warhead itself would continue on like a large bullet. From a really sharp glancing angle, now, I'm going to have an artist do it again with a different angle.
Did the warheads explode, or were these without warheads?
They don't need to explode to be able to do the damage. These warheads
right. That's what I'm asking,
Yeah, and they wouldn't want these to explode to have caused that damage. However, some of them did explode. And let me just take
Fascinating stuff, Steve. I feel very much about this as I did the first time I interviewed Judy Wood, because here she was introducing a whole new approach to understanding what happened at the World Trade Center. And I let out this whoop, something like, wow, because the conceptual space, of what we were dealing with had been enormously expanded. And people thought I was thereby swooning in support of her theory. I was swooning in support of the expansion of the intellectual space. I love what you're doing here. I have a very similar feeling about it, that you've offered us a whole new approach to understanding how those cutouts were made. I love it.
Well, thank you. So, and I can get into it deeper. I don't want to waste a lot of time by starting to look.
Today's good. For an introduction, this is perfect, Steve.
Yeah. So after I came to these conclusions and found these this concept, I rejected it as well. I thought there's no frickin' way they would launch multiple missiles in broad daylight, to do this. But I cannot come up with any other conclusion. And of course, they own all the media. They can control the narration, the narrative. So they're going to control the whole story. And of course, the idea of missiles are going to be rejected, especially if it's the right answer.
Were there other locations from which witnesses report seeing missiles fired than Woolworth?
No, but ironically enough, if you follow the trajectory, and those reports were for the North Tower, but if you follow the trajectory of these arrows away from the North Tower, it goes right past the Woolworth building.
Right past?
It goes right past the Woolworth building. Here, I have a video on my website.
That's all good. Steve, this has been absolutely sensational. I can't thank you enough. I'm thrilled. I find it fascinating. You've given me so much to think about, an original approach. I really value that. The hardest part of scientific research is fashioning an hypothesis, especially in sufficient detail that you can explore it. You have done that. That's a great accomplishment. I compliment you. I'm very, very impressed. I find this fascinating. I learned a lot from our exchange today. I look forward to featuring you on the show again.
Thank you. I look forward to it too, and I will be better prepared.
Well, you did a great job. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on the Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Steve Dock, for being here, and all of you for watching.
Thanks again, Jim.